When Michelangelo was painting the ceiling of the Sistine Chapel, his idea was to outdo all the other artists before him who had painted the walls of the Sistine Chapel. Particularly, along the walls were two series of frescoes, one showing scenes from the life of Moses, the other one showing scenes from the life of Jesus. These scenes were painted between 1481 and 1482 by some of the best artists of that day, including the likes of Botticelli, Rosselli, Ghirlandaio and Pietro Perugino. Among these scenes, the most impressive one was the giving of the keys to Saint Peter e Perugino, and thus Michelangelo knew that his work would most of all be compared to this famous work. And as he was climbing past this fresco every day to the top of the scaffold, Michelangelo realized that this fresco contained much brighter colors like gold and ultramarine than he used in his first scenes. Michelangelo did not like this large area of bright colors and rather focused on the spirit and movement of his figures, but he realized that his works may look relatively pale in comparison to Perugino's fresco, so he decided to make a compromise, adding brighter colors to the scenes closer to these wall frescoes. If you look at the whole ceiling, you can clearly see that the scenes in the center use less bright colors than the ones on the top and the bottom. The order in which Michelangelo painted the ceiling was to start with one of the main panels, and then paint the spandrels and lunettes besides the main panel. So after completing the great flood, he painted the two spandrels and lunettes on either side of it. Then he moved on to the next main panel, completed the spandrels and lunettes next to that one, and continued his way down the ceiling. So let's look in some more detail at the scenes in these spandrels and lunettes. Above the windows on each side of the chapel are 8 triangular spaces known as spandrels. As you can see, these are curved surfaces asking for triangular compositions, and on top of that, they are among the smallest spaces that Michelangelo had to paint, keeping in mind that people would only be able to admire them from ground level 20 meters below. Michelangelo decided to include some family scenes in these spandrels, and because of the limited space, the families are all seated. The scenes all show a husband and wife with 1 or 2 children, and of all the scenes on the ceiling, the interpretation is least clear as we don't know which figures from the Bible they represent. The exception may be the Salmon spandrel, which shows a woman making a new garment for her child. The woman has been identified as Hannah, the mother of the priest Samuel. The male figure wears a distinctive hat, which suggests that he is a priest, which makes sense as Hannah sent her young son to the temple to live there to become a priest. One of the first 2 spandrels he painted shows a woman with orange hair in a green and orange dress seated next to her older husband who is wearing a scarlet robe. As you can see, these colors are somewhat more outspoken than the ones he used for his main scenes. The reason is that they were closer to the frescoes on the middle of the walls painted about 3 decades earlier by artists like Botticelli and Perugino. As explained in the beginning of this video, these scenes were more colorful, and Michelangelo did not want his scenes to look too pale in comparison to these colorful scenes. Unlike the main scenes in the center of the vault and the spandrels next to them, both curved surfaces and part of the ceiling, the lunettes were painted on a flat vertical surface. This was a big relief for Michelangelo, who had spent so much time bending his head backward to paint the ceiling. Now he could just stand straight, something that was much more comfortable and also much easier as this was a flat surface. Having gained confidence with the fresco technique, he could paint his lunettes much quicker. He even abandoned his usual practice of first applying large cartoons with the outlines of his frescoes to the wet plaster, and he decided to work freehand on the plaster. Michelangelo chose a pretty unconventional topic for these lunettes. When artists chose to depict a series of characters from the Bible, they typically chose for prophets or apostles. And in the few instances when an artist had chosen to depict the ancestors of Jesus, they were shown as regal characters wearing a crown or a halo, befitting illustrious characters like Abraham, Jacob, Joseph, and Kings David and Solomon. Michelangelo chose to depict the forefathers as pretty humble characters instead, and he painted a total of 14 scenes of forefathers over the 4 years that he worked on this ceiling. Many of the forefathers are involved in simple daily activities. Here is for example the lunette of Nathan, one of the forefathers of Jesus as mentioned in the Gospel of Matthew, chapter 1 verse 4. He is seen on the right reading a book, and the woman, possibly his wife, who is looking at herself in an oval mirror. And as you can see, Michelangelo did not only include the forefathers of Jesus, although those are the ones mentioned by name, he also included several women and children, something that was highly unusual. I am not going to discuss all these scenes here at length, as they are a little bit less dynamic and revolutionary than some of the other scenes on the ceiling. But let's have a closer look at one more scene here. This is the lunette with Salmon, Boaz and Obed. The figure of Boaz, better known as Boaz, on the right is an interesting one. He was a wealthy landowner and the great-grandfather of King David, and he is described as gentle and generous in the Bible. But Michelangelo gave this figure his own twist, showing him as an eccentric old man angrily staring at his walking stick. It is as if Michelangelo wanted to include some humor as well. Not surprising if you work for 4 years on a project. The 4 corners of the ceiling have triangular curved spaces that Michelangelo also had to paint. He reserved these 4 so-called Pendentives for some of the more popular and cruel scenes of the Old Testament. These scenes are specifically associated with 4 Old Testament heroes who had contributed to the freedom and salvation of the Israelites, and we will go through them one by one. And to put it in perspective, these Pendentives were, together with the 9 main scenes in the center of the ceiling, the largest areas Michelangelo had to paint on the ceiling. The first Pendentive shows one of the most famous stories of the Old Testament. It shows the small shepherd boy David sitting on top of the Philistine giant Goliath, about to behead him with his own sword. We can still see the sling of David in the foreground, which he used to hit Goliath with a stone in between his eyes. Goliath had survived this first attack, and now it is up to David to finish the job. The second Pendentive shows the story of Judith and Holofernes, as described in the book of Judith. Not all branches of Christianity include this story in their Bible, as the Protestants, for example, consider this an apocryphal book. Nevertheless, the story had been very popular in art history. It deals again with a decapitation, and this time Judith has already chopped off the head of the Assyrian general Holofernes. Judith is dressed in yellow in the center, and her servant is holding up a basket with the head of Holofernes above her head, which Judith is about to cover up. You can see how Michelangelo kept the composition of this scene and the scene of David and Goliath relatively simple, having learned from the overly crowded compositions with small figures in his first frescoes, which were difficult to see from 68 feet down, as explained in the previous video in this series. The third Pendentive shows Haman nailed to a tree, resembling the Crucifixion of Christ, and the art historian Giorgio Vasari deemed the figure of Haman the most impressive one among all the ones painted on the ceiling by Michelangelo. The story of Haman is described in the book of Esther. Haman was a public servant who tried to convince the king of Persia, the husband of Esther, to slay all the Jewish people in his kingdom. It was among the last scenes he painted on the ceiling, and although Michelangelo had almost spent 4 years working on the ceiling, he did not rush this work. Whereas he had completed the last main scene showing how God divided light from darkness in a single day, he would take 24 days for this scene. This last pendentive took Michelangelo 30 days to complete, and looking at the extremely complex poses and composition, this may not be a total surprise. It shows a scene from the book of Numbers in which the Israelites were complaining to Moses about their hunger and thirst while getting through the desert. God reacted by sending several poisonous serpents who killed many of them. With God's help, Moses came to the rescue by creating a bronze serpent on top of a pole, which you can see at the top center, and anyone bitten by a snake could look at this bronze serpent and would be cured. Michelangelo chose for a quite chaotic composition, showing the suffering of the Israelites among the writhing snakes. And this concludes the third video about the scenes on the ceiling of the Sistine Chapel. In the first video, I discussed the design of the ceiling. The second video in this series focused on the 9 main scenes from the book of Genesis, and today's video covered some of the other areas of the ceiling. If you have not seen the first 2 parts of this series, I can highly recommend you checking them out. That leaves us with looking at 2 more elements. First, the spectacular series of 5 Sibyls and 7 prophets from the Old Testament. And second, the series of 20 unparalleled nude people called ignudi, flanking the 9 main scenes in the center. I hope you enjoyed this video, and as always would like to ask you to hit the thumbs up button if you enjoyed it. Leave a comment down below with any questions you may have about the ceiling or your thoughts about the video. And finally, don't forget to subscribe to the channel and hit the notification bell to be alerted when the next videos in this series are released. It helps the channel a ton. Thanks for watching.